Welcome back, Loveaholics, to Confessions of a Loveaholic. I am your host, Emmy Hernandez, and I have an amazing, very special guest with me today, and I'm excited to introduce you to her. Her name is Dr. Diane Mueller. She is a board-certified sexologist. Oh yeah, whoop, whoop. We love having our sex talk on the show. With dual doctorates in naturopathic as well as acupuncture and oriental medicine. She is the founder of the sex education center mylibidodoc.com and hosts the Libido Lounge podcast. Make sure you go find it, subscribe, where she helps monogamous couples create more passion, desire, hotter sex, and better communication. Dr. Diane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Emmy. I'm so excited to get into all of our love sex confessions today.
I love it. I'm so happy that you are here. I am very excited for us to get into a lot of these topics, and I purposely did not get into this behind the scenes with you because I wanted to make sure that I asked you all the questions like straight up front, exactly on here, and capture your fullest expressions. I myself am in a monogamous relationship with my husband. We've been together for 8 years now. And it has been absolutely amazing and fascinating thanks to the work that I've done before and some of the research on this. I'm not an expert like you are, but as someone who specializes in relationships and healthy relationships, especially monogamy, that's one of the areas that I love. It has been fascinating seeing our personal sex life have its roller coasters and ups and downs. And most recently, one of my biggest roller coasters was getting really sick with some hormonal stuff and having to have emergency fibroid surgery, right? So that has obviously been something that has affected my pelvic floor function. And I had no idea what was going on with the pelvic floor and how that can affect just the entry point of the vaginal canal. So for those of you who haven't heard the most recent episode, go listen to TMI. I go through the whole details in there, but I wanted to set the premise here of this is a space, this is a safe space where there's no judgment. We are gonna be here to learn together. And when we learn about some of the things that happened, we release a lot of the shame, a lot of the guilt. And, I also grew up with a lot of shame around sex with growing with the purity culture in the Catholic Church. I grew up in a super strict Mexican Catholic household, and I had promised that I was not going to have sex until I got married, and that got thrown out the window as soon as I came into college. But just because I had the physical act did not mean that didn't mess with my emotions around it. So just wanted to give you all a little bit of context around, we're not going to cover all of the topics here today, but we are going to cover some of them. And this is coming from a place of healing our emotions and knowing some of the yummy things that we get to do in these beautiful relationships, especially around monogamy. So I have my very first question for you, Dr. Diane. Are we ready? Are we ready to get rocking and rolling on
I'm
this?
ready. Bring it.
I love it. So, Dr. Diane, there's in the world of social media and TikTok and all of the things on there, everybody talks about how monogamy is monotonous, monogamy is boring, blah blah blah. You're going into all of these stories. So you and I know a little bit more about the magic of how our brain works, right? And what the brain needs around this and what the body needs. So we're going to get into that. How do we create novelty in monogamy so that it's not monotonous?
So, thank you, Emmy. And to answer this question, I want to start with a story, which is I was listening to this lecture by the founder of NLP, of neuro linguistic programming, Richard Bandler. And he was telling a story that really impacted me and my work. And the story was that he was talking about when he was getting ready to be married, that a lot of his friends and just people were coming up to him and saying something like, "Oh, get ready for the sex to end. Get ready for the sex to get bad." And, this type of programming that I think is so common. And so, being somebody that had created and co founded a program that works on the mind and the belief structure and all that, his answer really struck me, which was, so you mean to say that I'm going to practice something over and over and over again and get worse at it? And it's like, how true is that, right? When we think about monogamy, right? And we're thinking about, like, okay, this passion dies and it becomes monotonous and all of these kind of things. How is that possible in many ways when we're actually doing something over and over and over again? And anything else we do over and over again, a sport, learn a new interest, or a new instrument, or a new language, anything else we practice like that, we actually get better at it. So I think that's the first thing I want our listeners to hear as far as, what is actually happening here. Because I think the moment we can take a step back and say, oh, you're right, like this is like abnormal. This doesn't have to be this way. Typically, if we practice something, we do get better at it. We actually get more skilled at it. And that's one of the things I've seen so different in monogamy versus something like polyamory or open relationships. And different, I think, in poly, in cases where people have like many long-term lovers. But when people have more like open relationships and they have these random lovers here and there, yeah, you might have some of that juicy chemical happening in your head for sure. But if somebody doesn't get to know us enough to know things like, oh, like you put your hand slightly this way versus that way, it's going to make a difference. If you whisper this into my ear versus that, if you tilt your pelvis this way versus that, it's going to make a difference. So some of that is like kind of the foundation of why that happens. I want to pause since I just said a lot before I go in and actually answer your question. Did you have any thoughts on that before I continue?
I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that story from Richard Bandler. That is so true. We're like, how could you get worse at something that you're continuing to practice around
Right.
it? And I love that, right? So this is where we go into the psychology of the energy behind it, right? And the intention. So there's so much more to cover here, but I love it. Give us more, right? So let's go into
Okay.
now setting that premise, right? So setting the premise of first um questioning that paradigm, right? Or people are like, oh, get ready for the sex to end, or like anybody who's been together for a long time, like they're like by default. So one of the things I think you can help me with here is to tell people that it's very normal, and it's actually our brain is designed in the way where the novelty needs to be reintroduced. It has nothing to do with you not liking your partner anymore. Like the passion has to die down, the chemical passion, right? And there's a reason why I talk about, and you've heard me talk about on the show before, audience, the conscious honeymoon, right? There's a difference between the chemicals in your body of when you first meet someone or something's new, and then after a while you've watched the same movie with this person for like the last 6 months or whatever. By default, it has nothing to do with this other person. You'll be bored of your new car after a year. Okay, so we are designed this way for survival reasons. So please know it has nothing to do with quote unquote passion dying down. Passion can be reintroduced, and that's what Dr. Diane is going to tell us about here around novelty. So please know that there's nothing quote wrong with you if you're like, oh, we don't have the same passion that we did when we first started dating. No shit, Sherlock. Okay, that's normal. That doesn't mean you stay there. That doesn't mean you give up. That means like, how can we reintroduce the intention of novelty? How can we introduce some newness to your brain and your body and the yumminess? Okay, so that's Dr. Diane is gonna give us some more yumminess on that.
Yes. Yeah, and such good points, right? Because I think one of the things that happens so much of the time is feeling of sadness or frustration or just disappointment or something like that, where it's like, wow, I would love this passion there is not there anymore. We feel this emotion about it. And that emotion is huge. It's not that emotion is wrong. In many ways, that emotion is extremely right. That emotion is that cue to say, oh, something is like out of balance, that like, let's fix it. And that out of balance is just like you said, it's normal and natural in many ways for this to happen. And that emotion then is just like a quick cue for us to actually say, okay, now we're going to put into place some of these things to bring that back. So taking a step back then to answer your original question, like, why is this happening and where is the novelty playing a role with this? So in that new relationship energy, what is ultimately happening there is that we have a increase of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is about reward, it's about motivation. And so with dopamine, like in that new relationship, what will happen is we meet somebody and we kind of like them, we think they're sexy, and all of a sudden we're like, okay, we're going to talk to them, and they get our number. And then there's a hit of dopamine when we're thinking about them. Are they going to call? Are they going to text? And we're getting a little bit of dopamine every time we think about them. And then they do call or they do text, and then we get a big dopamine boost. And then are we going to kiss? And are we going to have another date? And are we going to make love? And all the stages of it, all that anticipation is little drips of dopamine, and then meeting that goal and meeting that thing that we're going to do with them, that big dose of dopamine. So a lot of that driving of that passion is this dopamine and kind of unknown. Like we in survival, like you bring up survival, like in survival, we are not going to be in the depths of our safety, in the depths of like really letting go when we're constantly like, is this going to work? Is this going to happen? Or survival, like, where's the tiger? Where's the cave? Where's the bear? Where's the attacker? And all of those chemicals involved in that all have this impact. And then we get into the regularity. And many times for most people, long enough leads to living together, for many people married, for a lot of people kids, maybe combining business, chores. The list goes on and on and on and on. And then there's no room for this dopamine to be created because you wake up, alarm goes off, 6 o'clock, whatever time it is, out of bed, you know who's going to work when, who's coming home when, you know what you're doing on Thursday, you probably what you're doing on Friday, rinse, 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 repeat. And without that space, without that time, without that anticipation towards something new, then there's a lot of that motivation, and that drive fails. And then there's lack of passion because there's a lack of that fundamental driver towards your partner. So there's obviously other things from a low libido standpoint we can talk to, but from the standpoint of like the physiology of what's happening, that is the foundation of what's happening here. And so the novelty, right? Novelty in the beginning of the relationship, like I described, like that is that first kiss, that second date, that time you go to town together, first, and even second and third and fourth. It takes a while for some of those things to not feel new anymore. And so what typically happens intimately in relationships is we fall into the same pattern. Like people have what we call in sexology sexual scripts. And these scripts are like, we kiss for 2 minutes, we do this, we do that. We kiss for 2 minutes, we do this, we do that. You turn me on your back, you go down on me, I go down on you, we get in this position, boom, we have the big orgasm, right? It's like this continued thing that people tend to have over and over and over again, repeat. Again, no novelty. And we just go through the motions. And not only the passion dies, it's also kind of boring after a while. Like if we eat the same food and we watch the same TV show, like you mentioned, like it's going to get boring. Like maybe not the second time, but definitely by the 20th, 30th, 40th, 50th, 1,000th time. Very, very, very boring. So part of bringing novelty back is there's different ways to do it. One is you can start with a yes, no, maybe checklist, and you can actually get one from my website for free at hotterlife.com. And so if you go there and download this checklist, it's a fun way of working with your partner around, hey, let's go through and let's look at all these things. Like there's maybe 100 or 150 things on that checklist. All these things, a lot of them sexual, but some of them more just like sensual intimacy or emotional intimacy. Like, and you go through and you say, oh, these are our yeses, these are our hell no's, and these are our maybes. And then you see where you line up. And if you're maybe on something and your partner is a yes, then you can go back and have a conversation on, oh, I think this, if we made like, what about a maybe would make it a yes? What about a maybe would make it a no? And we have a conversation about that. And there's 2 more things to say on this, and I'll pause here. But one of the things with this is we want to be very, very careful when we do this, that before we do a yes, no, maybe checklist and talk about it, we actually have a discussion with our partner to say, hey, if you don't like something that I like, or if you think something that I like is weird to you, like, how do we both want to, like, what are our agreements on how we're going to respond to the other person? If we're like, wow, I had no idea you had that fantasy or fetish, and like, I think that's a little weird, we want to be very careful around how we respond, because the last thing we want to create with this exercise is shame. So if we have a conversation beforehand where it's like, oh, if you're feeling like something I am into is a little bit weird or a little off putting, can you respond this way to me? Because then I'll know that you're not into it, but I won't feel shame or guilt or anything like that. So we want to have that going into it. And the other thing that makes this so useful from a standpoint of novelty is just like when we take it back to the new relationship energy and we're like, okay, that date on Friday, and like maybe we haven't seen this person an entire week and we're thinking about what we're going to wear, maybe our lingerie as women, and the whole what's going to happen, all these different things. And the same thing can happen with novelty, because then from there, a fun thing to do is have like bougie sex date nights. And bougie sex date nights typically are planned, and I recommend that they're planned. And then, like, let's say, okay, on sex date night Saturday that's coming up, we are going to try this new position in this new room in the house, and we're going to wear a wig or something like that to mix things up. Right? There's a lot of different ways to do this, and you'll see that on the checklist. Then you can, like, all week long, it gives you something to flirt about. And then what you can do is take that and say, oh, I am so excited about XYZ on Saturday night. And that's how you start to bring that flirt and that desire back in, because now we're creating that space. And now we're continually pinging the brain with the thought of what's coming, which then actually can allow for one, that flirt to come back in, which is just fun on its own, but two, that dopamine to come back in, and therefore that desire to come back.
I absolutely love that, Dr. Diane. I'm gonna go grab that checklist right now as soon as we're
Yay!
done with your list. Like, I hadn't heard of it that way. And you gave us some examples around the novelty, and thank you so much for creating that for us, because it is so important, and having the conversation around like, hey, like, how do we discuss this sort of upfront before we go into the details of this, of like what we think that's weird. It goes into like bases of communication, right? Of like not shaming your partner for something that they may like or not, regardless of whether it's not sexual. I'll give you an example. My husband will not eat sour cream, any ranch, no dressings, and no avocado. And like, it drives my Mexican family bonkers because we put that on everything. So they think here's the weirdest, right? So like, and that's something where he doesn't care whether or not they think he's weird, because there's no emotional attachment to whether or not he eats the ranch or any of the sour cream. But when it comes to our sexuality, there can be so many emotions tied to that. So it's so important to bring that energy to that. And I love your context around like the novelty and being able to create, because it is that anticipation, right? Most of the desire and most of the foreplay happens in just the anticipation of getting into that. And that's where the monotony comes in, because monogamy does not have to be monotonous. This is very important. That's why we talk about this and bringing in the novelty on purpose. It has to be intentional, right? This is what it means to put an effort into relationships. I don't believe that relationships take hard work. I think that's a paradigm I'm here to break. But anything you care about takes effort. And this is what we're discussing here. And we happen to be discussing relationships and monogamy, but honey baby, if you're listening, you know that anything in your life that you care about takes effort. This is just another one of those areas. So, Dr. Diane, I want us to shift gears here a little bit to go into some more of the the areas that people want to know about, because sometimes there can be some shame or some confusion around this. Like, what are some causes that create low sex drive in men and women, whether they be physical, personal, or interpersonal reasons behind low libido? How can we understand that a little bit more? Is it always sort of a loss of enamorment, right? Sort of like with the partner. Is it physical sometimes? I know one of them was for me. Is it emotional? What are some of these causes? And also discussing how it happens for men and women, and are some of them different, are some of them, I'm sorry, are some of them the same, are they different, and what should we know about that is quote unquote maybe normal or average, so we don't feel so weird if we so encounter some of.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there, Emmy. I think we could go on for days on this topic, but just to be kind of high level and give them a few details on this, I think one of the first places to start is that when it comes to low libido and the root causes of this, two things I want to say first. One is that I think we have to get the shame out of this. There's so much shame around for men, things like erectile dysfunction. For women, there's a lot of shame. And I've been talking about this to a few women this week around not being able to get wet and anxiety around that, because oftentimes there's like this belief that if a woman's not responding, she's not into it, or she's not into somebody, their partner. And so there can be like, bi-directional shame on just like genital responsiveness. And we have to get the shame around sex and around sex not going well out. Because the fundamental thing of this is there's really no difference here than saying, hey, there's any other imbalance in the body, mind, or relationship, right? Like there's a million different ways for the body to get out of balance. There's a million different ways for the mind and the personal system to get out of balance. There's a million different ways for the relationship to get out of balance. And all we're talking about is any of those things actually impacting our libido and our sex life. So we really got to get, the stigma out. So if you're listening and like there's any shame or guilt, like I talk to people all day long about this. This is one of the most normal and common things. I shouldn't say normal from a standpoint of like it's out of balance. So it's like things are not working normally, but I should use the word common. It's a differentiation I like to make. That is one of the most common things I see. And so we got to get the shame and guilt out of it. Now, second thing to say is that when it comes to root causes, when we're talking about these things and saying what's really going on here, majority of the time it's more than one thing. So there might be an element of something going on in the physical body, not knowing one's own personal self, interpersonal, and I'll break those down in a moment. But as you're listening to these, definitely consider, hey, there can be like a predominant thing, but in most cases, I see that there's more than one reason for this, which is why people go and like get things like a testosterone prescription and see, in many cases where libido comes back on and it's great for a few weeks. And then all of a sudden it's like, crap, where'd my libido go again? I see that so commonly, and it's because, oh, that was one root. So you got a little boost. But then once your body gets used to it, then it's like, well, there's other things going on here that have to be addressed. So that's super common. So from like what you said in your intro question here, physical, personal, interpersonal. These are three kind of pillars, three categories that I have put all the root causes that I have found into for, easy teaching and explanation. So the first pillar, the physical root causes, these are things such as blood flow, hormones, neurological imbalance, stress imbalances, pelvic floor dysfunctions. Those are kind of the top five. Other things can certainly be there: infections, inflammation, toxins. We have, many other things, but those are some of the top five that I see. You can go, here's another free resource for you and your listeners. If you go to libidoquiz.com, you'll actually find a free quiz there that is going to help you think about, out of these physical root causes, which ones are the most likely ones that are pertinent to you. And then when you take the quiz, you'll get emailed information about what the results mean, including lab tests to consider to ask your doctor about to make sure you're really getting, the lab testing that you need. So that's at libidoquiz.com. But that's the personal side of things. Now, one of the things I want to say there before moving on and talking about the interpersonal, I'm sorry, that's the physical side of things, what I just listed. One of the things I want to say there before moving on to the personal and the interpersonal is that in answer to your question around, do I see this in women versus men or both? One of the things that I think is a huge misunderstanding from the sexual health standpoint is that men really need this huge amount of blood flow, and it's not as important for women. And for women, we have a ton of erectile tissue, actually a very similar amount as men. Ours as women just takes close to 20 minutes to actually fully engorge. So we don't see that like level of response of that quickness and responsiveness that we get in males. But from a standpoint of are these all important? Absolutely. And one of the things that actually can cause things like vaginal dryness, sometimes it can be hormones. Sometimes it can be low circulation, for example. So if you don't have the blood flow to the tissue, you can actually have vaginal dryness from that as well. So that's kind of high level physical side of things. And then to move on to the second pillar, the personal roots, the personal side of things. This is all about how well you know your body. Actually, I'm going to grab my model real fast here. So this is my pelvis. And so you can see, so anybody that's listening and not watching, what I have here is a anatomical pelvis of the female. And so I'm going to kind of talk this out just for the people that are listening and not watching. And so we have our clitoral hood and the clitoral bulb. So that's what most of you think of as the clitoris itself. And then what a lot of people don't realize is we have these long legs. So almost think of a wishbone to our auditory listeners. So it's almost this like wishbone like structure that goes all the way deep and sits under the pubic bone. And then we also have between the inner labia, the inner lip, and the outer labia, we have this spongy tissue. And all of these areas that I'm mentioning here are so incredibly potent with sensation. And what's interesting is based upon the neurological system of one woman to another, what women will find is that some of these areas are more sensitive or less sensitive, and some of these areas are too sensitive. So, for example, some women, their clitoral head, their clitoral bulb, these areas, like the areas that we think of as the clitoris, these areas are so sensitive that they're almost like overly sensitive, where it's like it can actually almost be even painful to touch, or maybe they're touched and the orgasm happens so fast that there's no time to build, that it's like you can go straight into climax without even enjoying it for some women. Other women, it's like a very different sort of sensation where it's like it's actually not as potent, right? So in the personal root cause, one of the most important things is how well do you know your own erogenous tissue? How well do you know your own erogenous zones? And for some women, what you'll find is like the clitoral legs or the spongy tissue, for example, has way better sensation than and way more enjoyable sensation than places like the clitoral bulb or even the internal G spot, which is, talked about so much online. So it's really important to, to begin to learn this, to begin to learn things like, hey, but for a standpoint of orgasm, for example, there's an anatomical difference between when women can easily orgasm for penetration or from penetration versus not. So if your clitoris is I shouldn't say too far, is farther from your vaginal opening, there's a bigger space there, it's going to be harder for you to climax that way. And so many women, I think, have this feeling around like, oh my goodness, if I'm not like coming, if I'm not orgasming from penetration, there's something wrong with me. And, I've heard men very inappropriately say something like things like, well, if it was my woman, my dick would always be able to please her. And these horrible things, right, that are really not understanding that it's not about the penis. Like the penis can make a difference, but it's more about the uniqueness of the female anatomy and as far as what is going to actually bring her to climax. And so then when it comes to like more the interpersonal side of the relationship, it can be difficult then to actually begin to be able to tell our partner, hey, you need to go a little faster here, or you need to actually rub this area under my inner lip, or like I need this area of my labia or this area of my vulva actually stimulated for 10 minutes before we go further, right? Or I need my breast touched this way. Like so many men go straight to female breast and play with them like men like to, hard touching and squeezing and like kind of like this aggressive movements. And that can be fun. But for most women, that is not the way their bodies like to start, right? It's like warming up the breasts with slow, sensual touch. And so, even in the personal space, it's like, how do your breasts like to be touched? How do your thighs like to be touched? How does your vulva like to be touched? So, it's really about how well do you know yourself? And then, of course, in there is like any genital image or body image, things that come up there, and working with those, because it is very difficult, and I believe impossible, to have an orgasm or have high amounts of pleasure when we are like, well, this position makes my thighs look fat, or this position you can really see my belly rolls, right? And I know, like, I've done it, right? And so I know that this happens. I've seen myself do it. I've watched my internal dialogue, and it's something that we actively have to watch and cultivate and practice self-care and self-awareness and self-kindness and all of that. So all of that is in the personal. And then in the interpersonal root cause, it's all about what is our relationship with being able to talk about sex and communicate sex with our partner. In fact, one survey I found said that of all people that the survey was done on people that reported having phenomenal sex, right? They were so happy about their sex life, and it looked for like similarities. And one of the similarities that this survey found was that 91% of couples with reporting like the most awesome sex talked about it. 91%. That's like, and I've seen that in my work, but it's like really cool to see that in surveys too. And so the interpersonal is how well are we actually able to come together and talk about it and have this communication to say, oh, I know your body so well and you know my body so well. And it might be awkward sometime, and that's okay. And here's how we're going to work with that. And here's how we're not going to shame each other. And here's how we're going to ask for what we want. And here's how we're going to realize that what we were doing in our 20s, if we've been together, 40 years, here's how we're going to realize that what we were doing in our 20s actually might not work the same in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. So we have to talk about these things because the body's going to change and the sexual needs are going to change too.
Wow, Dr. Diane, thank you so much. We covered so much ground there. I had not heard about the distance between where the clit is and the vaginal entry. Like, that's fascinating, because I know there's so many conversations around like being able to orgasm through penetration or not, and like the either self-dialogue or community dialogue, whether people are being honest about it or not. And this is just absolutely fascinating. I love what you brought up around at the end about having conversations with your partner around this, and how sex in your 20s, 30s, and 40s and beyond can be different, right? So you made me think about, right, that, when my partner and I started having sex, and this happens to a lot of couples, there wasn't really so much of the conversation happened with our hands and everything else involved. Right, it was very much a sexual physical experience, as we've gotten, as our bodies have adjusted, as our brains have adjusted, as our chemicals have adjusted towards each other. The passion is still there, but the conversation of the verbal sort of setup towards the sexual has to be there now, way before anything else is gonna work. And sometimes it doesn't even need to happen in the moment. It can be a conversation ahead of time. So there's a lot more planning involved. And I want you to know the planning can be sexy. Okay, you can make sexy planning, because if you would have told me this in my early 20s of what I'm doing now, close to 40, I would laugh. You'd be like, oh my God, that's how you're having sex? Like, ew. And it's funny to me now, because it's like we're having the hottest sex of our lives now. But it definitely has been an adjustment in how we converse about it, and the conversations. And for you to know that this is, it's healthy, right, listeners? This is very healthy. Dr. Diane is explaining to us how not only is it different to expect for there to be changes, right? To not feel like there's shame and guilt around that, although we understand, right? That's why we have Dr. Diane here, so you can talk to her if you want some more personal, private information around this. But I think it's just so healthy for us to discuss being able to talk to our partners around this. And trust me, it is. Do you have any tips on this, Dr. Diane, on how to start a conversation with our partner around this. And for the most part, from what I've seen in a lot of my clients, it's usually the woman that starts having some thoughts or some bodily changes first. How can she bring up some of these topics to her partner, since we're talking about conversations here? Do you have any tips for us on that, going on your note around how not to make them feel bad, especially if we're coming from a place of frustration, right? So how do we get ourselves in a place of like, okay, how can we both listen and not get defensive or make or hurt each other's feelings during this?
Yeah, yeah. I want to say that. I want to answer your question just real quick, just to comment on something you said around the idea of planning. This is something that so many people are like, well, I want to be spontaneous, and spontaneity is hot. And what a lot of people don't realize is they actually always were planning. And here's what I mean. So in the beginning of our relationship, once we, it's like, okay, we're having our date nights, et cetera, et cetera. And then, there is this level of, okay, like, yes, I like, now we're ready to like have our first kiss. Now we're ready to make love for the first time. And like usually like on, date nights in the beginning where it's like, okay, yeah, I think sex might be on the table. Like we're doing our hair, we're putting on our lingerie, we're making sure we like have our best perfume on, all the things. That is planning. So, what's interesting is we actually are in many ways planning all the time in the beginning when it's novel, when it's exciting, when it's new. And then once we start to combine our lives even more and see each other more, live together, that's actually when we stop planning. And it's like, it's interesting because there tends to be this correlation in some ways with like, there's this semi planning in the novelty stage. And then once we get past that, that is actually when the planning tends to stop because we're integrated. But now we're actually also expecting at that point for it to be spontaneous for the first time. So from that standpoint, I like people to orient. Like in some ways you were always planning. It's like, so planning was sexy in the beginning, so it can be sexy further on. So just my little comment on that
I just
reframe there for people.
I'm gonna just interject here
Please.
real quick because you just blew my mind. That is so true. OMG, we were always planning. This is just a different version of it. Holy shit.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Talking about breaking that paradigm there, because it's a lie that
It
we
is.
were planning before. It was just a different kind of planning. Holy moly.
Correct.
Thank you so much for bringing in that very powerful perspective, because that is
Yeah. Yeah, it's like that little shift I think can help people like realize like this doesn't mean that it's not like hot, right? It was hot in the beginning, like it can still be hot and we can still make dates and plan. So, okay, so then your question on how do we have conversations, right? And how do we talk about this? Well, to start that topic, one of the things I like people to understand is the research we see on conflict with couples shows that, and this is like anytime there's a disagreement, right? So this is nothing to do with sex. This is just like, oh, just standard, small conflict to larger conflicts. There's three threats that happen in the relationship: the threat to one individual, the threat to the other individual, and the threat to the pair, right? And so standard and normal conflicts, those three threats all tend to be fairly similar, right? So it's like, oh, there's a similar amount of threat to one person versus another as a relationship. When we're talking about sex and intimacy, what we've seen in studies is that one of those three threats is predominantly stronger, and that is the threat to the self. So that means in any conversation with a partner around sex, I'm going to be most worried, naturally, statistically speaking, about myself. My partner will be most worried, statistically speaking, about himself. And this is why these conversations oftentimes don't go as well, is because everybody has more of this tendency to kind of protect themselves. So it's so much easier in these conversations versus other types of conversations to get defensive. People theorize that the reason for this is due to evolutionary procreation around like survival of the species, around we have to make sure that we're good at this and we're functional at this to survive. And maybe there's something there, maybe there's not, but that being there is more a curiosity more than important. What is important is that this truly actually exists. So the way I like to advise people high level with this is the how, the when, and the where of communication. So the where will start there. So the where, I would definitely recommend do not have these conversations in your bedroom. Now, as you get, or any place that you predominantly have sex, right? And predominantly are physically intimate. And the reason for that is just muscle memory cues and neurological pathways. So we don't want this place as like, oh yeah, this is where we usually make love. And then we have this conversation and now we have this memory of like if it didn't go well and the memory is like there and we can walk into the room and have that memory triggered and cued in our brain. We don't want that association with that location. So that's one, that's the where. Two is the when. And the when is I do advise people to give their partners heads up on this. It's definitely not the best time to have a conversation around this when somebody is already in fight or flight, when they are in that kind of like upregulate, like their nervous system's charged, they're stressed. So a kind of a good intro to this can be like, hey, I listened to this great podcast or I read this great book and it made me really interested in talking about our sex life. I heard this stat that 91% of people talk about it have better sex, and I love our sex life. And I'm like interested in just talking about it more. Like, when could we do that? Right. So something like that where it's like it's going to let them know that this is coming. It's not the honey, we need to talk conversation. So they're not like coming into it being like, oh crap, I'm in trouble. And it's giving them permission to say, hey, tonight's not a good night. Now, that being said, I think we can. And I've seen situations where people can go too far the other way around, like, oh, well, it's not a good night now. I'm a little stressed now. And like, we want to be careful about overdoing that because then we can get into the avoidance and sweeping under the rug. So just kind of keep that in mind around like, yes, we want to make sure that it's not a day where somebody's been yelled at 7 times by their boss and the kids are screaming and, those kind of days. So we want to make sure it's not one of those kind of days. And we don't want to wait for that exact perfect moment because, that exact perfect moment may never come. So that's the when. And the how is probably the most important of all of them. So the how is all about the way we're introducing things. So one of the things that I would strongly recommend in the beginning, and this is why understanding the personal side of things is also so important. One of the things I recommend starting with is the things that you love. And the first conversation might just be like, hey, the last time we made love, you did this. And I just wanted more of that. And I just wanted to have a conversation to just let you know, like, you did this for 2 minutes. And like, I was just like longing for you to do that for 10 minutes because it was so good. Right. And so we are going to take and depending upon how this goes, we might not in that first conversation get to any of those things yet that we want to be different because we are just building our muscle here to actually have these conversations effectively. And sometimes people don't even like need to go into many things that they want to be different because oftentimes the more we start focusing on like, do this more of this, I love this more of this, I love this more of this, then then oftentimes there's just like not as much space for those things you don't like as much. And so the other way then we can like say something if we're like, well, this really has to go, and sometimes that is extremely important to say, is once we've like built this up, then we can say, and we can again ask permission here and like, and there's one thing that I used to love what you're doing here. And all of a sudden, I'm just like finding that my body is just like not responding a little bit as much as it used to. And I'm just wondering if we can tweak it a little bit. Are you okay if I tell you about that? And so you can see that like when I'm using this language, I'm like not making anybody wrong, right? I'm actually mostly just focusing on how our partner can actually provide more of what we want. And even when I say like, tweaking a little bit, like it's not saying like the act is wrong or they're not good at it or any of those, like that is always, almost always off the table, that kind of language. But we're just talking about tweaking. And sometimes it is like, it's like just like in looking at the female pelvis, sometimes the tweak is like, oh, just move a centimeter over to the left. Another thing we can say sometimes is like this, this thing that was I was once enjoying, like it's just like not stimulating me as much. And I learned that like the female body or the male body can change, and sometimes we can get scar tissue and things aren't working as well. So maybe we can explore in real time what my body needs now. Again, offering permission. So those are some of the fundamental do's and do nots that I have found to be pretty effective.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diane. I know my audience is going to just eat all of this up. And thank you for breaking down those those pillars and that premise, because it is absolutely critical to know that. I discuss this with my clients on the relationship side, not too much on the sex side, although this is absolutely perfect. And I'll give you all a freebie right now around, if you want to have an important discussion with your partner, one place that you do not do it is while you're driving in the car. I don't care who's driving, because you cannot by default give each other undivided attention. You have to be focused on the road, or else somebody could get hurt. So, but it's very tempting for the female brain to be like, oh, especially if they're on a road trip, like, oh, we're going to be in the car for 2, 3, 4 hours. Perfect time to talk. No, 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 no. Especially if
Exactly.
you're trying to get into some deeper topics, and especially if your partner is driving and he's driving and you want him to get emotional, or you want to be vulnerable in that space, that the driving is priority. And I know it seems tempting to be like, oh, well, we have all this time together. You want to make sure that no one's life is in danger, and that his brain is not being taken by a larger portion of capacity. And I got to tell you, once I learned that, it has completely shifted how much more my husband shares with me when we're not driving, although as tempting as it can be. So thank you so much for giving us that premise around the conversations around sex. And for those of you listening, if you're thinking like, oh, wow, this is such a beautiful way to bring some of these things up. And it also kind of sounds like how you would want to parent or do gentle parenting with your child. Yes, it is. Yes, yes, yes. This is what it means to have healthy conversations.
Yes.
Okay, this is what it means to have a healthy conversation and healthy premise. It is not about shaming. It is not about attacking. It is not about antagonizing. It is not about, and you also notice Dr. Diane did not say, oh, you know what? A great way to start this conversation is make a sarcastic comment. Start it off. He'll get it right away. Right? I see so much of this, so much on social media, and it's just so hurtful. Don't
Yeah.
listen to people who are not experts, please.
Yeah.
Go listen to Dr. Diane's show and mine, and keep coming to this, because we got your back in all areas. Trust me, the psychological, emotional, physical, and sexual, because all of these pieces need to work in order for there to be a healthy relationship. You can't just have one area that works really well. I've seen couples where they have super, super, super hot sex, and the 5% of the relationship, and 95% of it, everything else is super toxic. So for them, they can't have sex unless they're fighting. And that's also dangerous. So, let's not get into those sort of circles and cycles. So on that note, Dr. Diane, I absolutely love everything that we've talked about here. Thank you so much. We could go on literally for days about
For
this
sure.
and never be done with it. But I want to make sure that my audience knows where they can find out more about you and find your courses, find how they can book you. Please tell us where they can find about your stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go to my website, which is mylibidodoc.com. So I have a lot of different work on there. And I just realized in this moment, I might be getting my links mixed up here. So as far as I did get it correct. So the hotterlife.com is that yes, no, maybe checklist. And another great way of getting started, you guys, is if you go to mysexdoc.com, you can download a free copy of my ebook, which is 5 easy steps for mind-blowing orgasms and romance. So I have a lot of different ways you can work with me if you need more support, but those are like several freebies for you guys to just get you started. And then just go to my main website at mylibidodoc.com if you're interested in more taking my courses and working together more intimately.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diane. That has been amazing. Go check out all of her things. I'm going to go download everything that I can right now because it's absolutely amazing. Any final words for our audience today, Dr. Diane?
I just think the final thing is just back to this normalization of this conversation. Like, this is one of the most important things we can do for our personal life, for our intimacy life, is to talk about these things. And if things are not going perfectly for you this way, welcome to the club, right? This is so normal for the relationship to not be hot and heavy and passionate at any moment. But what is not normal is for it to stay there. So I think the more we start to say, like, yes, there's ebbs and flows in our relationship, just like there's ebbs and flows in, our health, or maybe our nutrition plan, or maybe how often somebody gets to the gym, right? But the more we commit to any of those things to make them priority in our life, the more we get into the flow and the less the ebbs really happen. And it really is just like you had started to say, like, this is something that I completely agree with you on. Relationships are not supposed to be hard work. I actually say similar stuff, but they are supposed to be effort. They do take time, they do take energy, and you and your relationship are worth it.
Beautiful. You know what? That's the best way we could end in here. We can end here. You and your relationship are worth it. I love you all, my recovering loveaholics. We will see you in the next episode. Thank you, Dr. Diane.